So we've been saying that inevitably in our lives we're going to find ourselves in situations where the structure of the situation demands a choice, a moral choice on our part between two values, or of one value out of maybe more than two, or other times, or just directions in life, not so much situation, where we're in a way we need to choose preferentially one value that's in perhaps an antinomical and oppositional relationship with another value. It's not even just from the structure of the situation, it arises from the complexity of individual values and virtues, implicating and involving others, needing counterweights, etc. And values themselves being an antinomical relationship. And so we're asked to do this. Life asks us, it presents us with these situations. Sometimes the choices are relatively simple, but when there's this antinomical relationship, etc., between values, it's not always so simple. And we can try to avoid this, but that's hardly a solution. Not very ennobling, not very helpful for our soul or the growth of our moral being. And so we incur a certain guilt with the responsibility that comes as we make those choices in life, as we navigate our path through life, through situations and in the general directions of our life. Now, one factor to consider here is why one person makes given a choice between, let's say, two values, why one person chooses to prioritize and invest in and care for and express and manifest one value, and another person chooses a different value. There's a consideration about of personal differences here that I think is really crucial. A difference in souls, in soul styles, in soul callings. So this must come into kind of a mature consideration of ethics. I touched on very briefly earlier, there are, we could say, moral duties that we have to the collective. I have a moral duty to the groups around me, the communities, the larger society, etc. And you have, each person has likewise a moral duty to one's own individual soul. And there can be a tension here between them, of course, and is not always easy. In a way, no one can flower fully as an individual. No one's soul can flower fully without drawing sustenance and all kinds of support, in fact, from the basis of, and a basis from the collective, from what's around them. The individual rises up out of that to whatever extent they, so to speak, rise up. But likewise, the collective, the community, the society is dependent on the individuals. And actually a really healthy community has individuated individuals. It's not a collection of replicas of unindividuated individuals. To the extent that the individuals that make up a community or society are true to themselves, listening to their callings, their soul's promptings and callings, caring for their duty to themselves, and allowing that to shape the flourishing of their being, the full flowering of their being. To that extent, a community is strong, is robust. So there's a kind of reciprocal dependency and reciprocal need between the collective and the individual. And in terms of the moral duties, there's a kind of tension there. So we already said that. But how does this? What can we say about about how the personal, what Hartmann would call the personality or soul style, is the duties of the individual duties of a soul, the soul duties that are individual. How does that come in, flow in, and influence and affect this whole discussion of ethics, especially where there's choices to be made between values, as there always will be, as we said. So some of what I want to explore a little bit here, or open out a little bit, may be, or may sound to some people, or may be considered a little bit provocative, maybe controversial, maybe contentious. I'm not sure. Maybe not at all to some people, maybe so to others. I'm certainly not seeking to provoke or to be controversial for the sake of it. I get absolutely no kick out of that kind of thing. But I do think it's important to try to open up this area, which is tricky, delicate, needs careful consideration. Can we just begin right now to open this up open up the whole field for kind of wider, deeper, some more careful considerations regarding ethics and soul. Especially as some of the things I want to go into now are kind of areas that are not usually considered when we consider ethics. But they are pertinent, and particularly they're pertinent if we're interested in soul-making, and axiomatic to soul-making is the principle of the necessity of my uniqueness and my particularities and my individual soul. Yeah, it's not at the exclusion of everything else, but that's a part of it. So these areas that I want to talk about are pertinent when we talk about Sila and Soul, ethics and soul. So I hope I'll do my best not to be clumsy. I'm sure inevitably I'll be a little clumsy in how I phrase things and treading in this delicate territory, but I'll do my best. So there's this whole range of values, a whole range of possible choices that we have, as I said, either in terms of the larger currents of our life or in specific situations. And we need to make choices. To not make a choice is also a choice, but as I said, not ennobling, not soul-making. So we need to make choices, and part of what comes into making our choices, part of what comes in, or what forms and shapes and directs and inspires different choices by different individuals, is those personal soul styles, personal, if you like, inclinations or callings or duties of the soul. Now, Hartmann points out, and I can't remember if I've said this, but it really is important to say, that the universal values, in other words, not the so for example, those basic precepts that we get in Buddha Dharma, or the basic sort of the last 5 of the 10 Commandments and that kind of thing, the universal values such as justice, etc. They need to form the basis, and in a way they have what he calls unconditional precedence. So they are kind of set in stone. In fact, they are like the 10 Commandments. They're chiseled in stone, and they form a platform, a foundation on which, on top of which, on the basis of which, the more differentiated personal values can be built and raised. So everyone needs to, everyone has an obligation to these basic universal values, and to the precepts organized around them. But on top of that basis, all kinds of choices present themselves in terms of the variegated emphases on different values that one can have, that there can be between human beings. But that's the foundation. So we need to bear that in mind. In a way, that sounds like, at least in abstracto like that, it sounds like a relatively simple formula, maybe. And sometimes it is very simple. Okay, you choose this, I choose that, you prefer this, I prefer that, I prefer developing this, I prefer investing in that. As long as we're keeping the universal values, we're both keeping those universal values, keeping a care for them, then all's well and good. And so sometimes it's that simple, but sometimes it's not. It's a little more tricky. It's a little more nebulous and ambiguous, and we draw in, of course, to our evaluation of others and self, sometimes what's just a kind of indoctrination or fashion or the dominant view of the culture, etc. And it's not necessarily such a open-eyed, unblinkered view of the moral landscape. Because some souls, as I sort of just see different people, read about different people, know different people, some souls, for example, may have a kind of soul calling to express or manifest what might be quite extraordinary virtues, not so commonly found virtues, a kind of boldness that's out of the ordinary, a moral courage that's out of the ordinary. For instance, to speak the truth, to stand up in the truth despite threats and possible dangers, etc. They might, in their soul style, express and manifest what Hartmann called this radiant virtue. The German Schenken der Tugend, I asked Kirsten and she said that's not a good translation, but I didn't ask her what a better one would be. She said it would be difficult to find words. But anyway, this radiant virtue, there's something in the being, it's like sunshine, spiritual sunshine just pours out of them and it radiates to those nearby. Sometimes just communicates non-verbally and indirectly, and sometimes through the direct interactions. That's not a common virtue, it's an uncommon virtue. Or a person may have a capacity for a kind of radical generosity. How they are with money, how they are with their possessions. A kind of magnanimity, a largeness of soul, a big spirit, a big heart. An adventurousness of spirit that's quite rare. So some people may have those kind of more extraordinary virtues, and their soul, that's their soul style, that's their soul shape, that's what they're called to manifest in this life. It's part of their ethos, their soul, their personality. And sometimes what I notice is that that manifestation, that soul style, may kind of come in a package, if you like, where, for example, other virtues are relatively neglected. We've touched on this a little bit before, or even contravened, or not, at least not developed so much. So, for example, they may not be gentle of speech. They may be at times quite harsh, quite even insensitive, judgmental, or they just seem to live in a way that keeps quite different sexual mores, for example. They may be quite promiscuous, and other people might be looking and judging, for instance, that promiscuity. And maybe that goes with the kind of liberality and freedom of soul. So oftentimes those particular those particular neglects of whichever virtues are relatively speaking neglected, are may be judged by others in the society, in the wider society, but those others may be relatively or even completely insensitive or blind to the particular set of virtues that this person is expressing. They're kind of blind to the radiant virtue, they're blind to the radical generosity, they're blind to the moral courage, or they don't value it so much, they evaluate it differently. And the others who are judging this person, I'm thinking of several people now, but I'll say something in a minute. So, the others who are judging might also be blind or insensitive to the very idea of duty to one's soul, to one's daemons, angels, to one's, what Hartmann calls, the ideal personality. So this is tricky. The universal values must be a foundation, must be a common universal foundation, but on top of this there's this space, amplitude for personal variation and disposition and inclination and the callings of the soul. Sounds simple, but it can be very tricky here. Because what exactly are those universal foundations? Well, where are the boundaries? So one of the people I'm thinking about is Bob Marley. I'm thinking of some others, but let's just focus on him right now, just very briefly. And to me, he had a lot of those qualities that I just rattled off as something exuding from his being, a magnanimity, a largeness of spirit, a radical generosity, a sort of openness of being, a radiant virtue. He just shines that kind of spiritual sunshine and beneficence. Boldness, adventurousness, courage, not to mention, of course, his creativity and his bestowing of his gifts artistically to humanity. And at the same time, for instance, some people would criticize him as being, well, he was extremely promiscuous sexually, and he wasn't faithful to his various women. I think he slept with people who slept with others while he was married and things like that. I don't know the exact details, but so to some people, well, he contravened the basic universal values, say in his sexual promiscuity. But I just have a question. In that particular personal, relational, marital, community and wider social context in which he lived at the time in Jamaica and that community, and that larger community, where in that context, in that complex of context, personal, relational, marital, community context and the wider social context, where exactly was the boundary of universal value, say vis-a-vis sexual behavior, or even fidelity to one partner, monogamy, etc. So, as I said, this is tricky. This is really tricky. I guess there's several points here. Partly it's the need for this faithfulness to the individual soul, and the individual soul's callings and the virtues that have a claim, that grasp the individual soul. And at the same time, the tension with the duties to both the collective and also to the faithfulness to the universal values. But sometimes these universal values are not exactly clearly, their edges are not clearly demarcated. And on top of all this, very often people who have that kind of certain kinds of spirit often get judged by people who are blind to certain virtues, or as I said, blind to the duty souls have, the duty each soul has to the particularities and particular callings of one's own soul. So, I don't know if that made sense, and as I'm trying to tread very carefully here, it's perhaps as best if we, again, view this as something for us to consider, something for you to consider carefully, to open up certain areas which don't usually get opened up. Rather than me provide an answer which I don't actually have. So there's somehow these tensions, there's a tension created by these pulls, these demands, these duties that pull in different directions. But the development of what Hartmann calls the personality towards what he calls the ideal of the personality. So for him, I think I touched on this in another series of talks, and I can't remember where, just very briefly. But for him, this is each person has an ideal personality. The ideal that, if you like, exists in the realm of ideal. We don't completely ever manifest. We don't completely ever express it fully, precisely, totally, faithfully. But we have, in a way, that constitutes in some ways our more real essence in some ways than what we actually do manifest in some ways. So there's that kind of view, and it's akin to when we talk about the angel out ahead or the daemon refracted, etc. So in his language, the development of our personality towards the ideal, or in faithfulness to the ideal, in hearkening, in listening, in duty to the callings and the shapings and the promptings of the either push and the pull of the ideal of our personality. That is a virtue. And so can we include that in our sense of values? The value of our individual personality, the value of our listening and caring for those individual soul callings, and the shapings and the growth of our soul. And included in that process, in the development of that virtue, and the care for that virtue, is each of us as individuals, our unique weighing and differential emphasis between different values, and our unique weighing up of different values. So how I weigh up and make a choice between different competing oppositional values in a situation or in my life is different than you and different than a third person, and that's part of shaping my being. At the same time, and with this principle of goodness being choosing the higher value. But just to say goodness is choosing the higher value doesn't give enough clarity always about what to do, and doesn't give a full enough picture of what's involved in the choices that are presented to us as souls in life. So yes, choosing higher, but combined with that we have this possibility to choose in different ways. That's part of developing our souls, part of our soul-making. And this faithfulness to our own soul's calling, and the particularities, the individualities, and what Hartmann calls our ideal personality, that's a virtue. So there's what he called, there's an ought and a duty to this unique, irreplaceable, once-in-a-cosmos soul. This unique, irreplaceable personality in Hartmann's terms. And that's also a moral demand. That itself is a moral value. It's a high moral value. Perhaps a very high one. But it can't, it loses its, it plummets in height if it loses its status as a value if we contravene universal values in our development of that. So this duty to this unique and irreplaceable once in a cosmos soul that you are. It's hard to find teachings like that, certainly in Buddha Dharma, certainly in kind of emptiness teachings or teachings of oneness, of which there are many different kinds. In general, they lack that. And it's actually quite unusual in moral philosophy to recognize that duty to our, what Hartmann calls ideal personality, to our personality, our duty to our individual soul. It's hard to... I'm not at all an expert on the sort of range of moral philosophy, but I'm not sure where else, maybe Max Scheler, I'm not sure where else you find such a thing in considerations of moral philosophers, which tend to try and kind of compact things to a single rational sort of rule of thumb, as Kant did, for example. So, within the realm of this consideration of what's an individual calling and our duty to that, I want to consider three particular kind of unusual manifestations within that. Again, for the sake of opening out what's less commonly opened out, and for the sake of our exploring the relationship of soul and Sila, because these ones in particular may have quite a lot to do with soul too, in particular ways. So one is the virtue of nobility, as Hartmann uses that word. So I tend to use it in a slightly different way, but it's not important. I want to talk about what he calls the noble, as one possible kind of virtue or value that, also orientation to values, as I explain it, you'll see what I mean, that, as I said, is rarer, but may have its place when we consider the callings of individual souls. So for him, the noble is the opposite of the common. Okay, so there's nothing to do with social class and money, and nothing to do with aristocracy in the usual sense of the word, nothing to do with ethnic or racial divisions, nothing like that. It's just the opposite of the common, this what he calls noble. So because in a way, he writes, goodness can sometimes be commonplace. There is such a thing, he writes, as hackneyed virtue, ignoble contentment, narrow-minded virtue and righteousness. Now, he's not saying that all goodness is like that. That would be not accurate or kind to say that at all. But and even when even when there's a hackneyed virtue, it doesn't make it bad. It's just something common. It's just what everyone does, or most people do. So this nobility that he's talking about is actually not everyone's concern. Goodness, this what it is to be good and to practice goodness, to invest in goodness, to care for goodness, that's everyone's concern. Nobility is something that's not everyone's concern. It's particular to some souls, if you like. It is uncommon. It is always and necessarily common to few, he says. So it's its opposite is the common, the usual, ordinary, in the well-worn track, he writes. Insofar as upon it goodness as well as badness can be found. So, and then by its very nature, the noble is not everybody's concern. So even among the good, if you like, if you can say the people who are good or who care for goodness, there are the noble and there are the not so noble. he says, it consists in nothing but an aristocracy of disposition. So what's he talking about? He's talking about something very particular here, and in a way it only partially overlaps with the way I might use the word usually, or most people might use the word usually. But so in any culture, there's a kind of generally accepted morality, in most cultures at least, certainly throughout history, maybe less so nowadays, but there's a generally accepted morality. And we talked about this historical fact of the shifting of moralities between cultures, different times and places in history, and different communities, etc. But this kind of search for what is not yet in the range of the accepted morality, he said, this is a noble search. Some people sensitive to, groping for, intuiting at the edge of grasping and being grasped by a value or a set of values that are out of the ordinary for that context that they're in, for that social context that they're in, and the accepted morality that has. So there's the kind of prevailing view, and that whatever that morality is, now it can be extended upwards into sort of higher reaches of the development of certain values. That would be one way for grasping what's out of the common range. But it can also kind of move laterally, if you like, on a more, not so much just upwards in terms of higher values or more extreme kind of reaches of a certain value, but also into different values that are not even on the radar of a accepted morality of a society, etc. So, and he says, it is to this also, as well as the height of moral values and extending the heights, to this also, this wider range, this moving into new territory, this sensing or this opening up of a novel ethical sensibilities. It is to this also that the searching glance of nobility is directed. Progress, therefore, in selecting values, even within the range of goodness, is itself a function of the noble, for nobility of character is the pursuit of the uncommon. And now what he's saying is that in a way there are kind of pioneers in any society or time and place whose antennae, whose soul receptors are sensitive to what is uncommon, what is beyond the scope of the usual sensibility. And in kind of opening up that sensibility, they break new ground. But in time, that new ground comes to be shared with, that those perspectives, those sensibilities, those priorities come to be shared with the larger part of society. And so what was sort of cutting edge new territory becomes actually relatively common. And then the process has to start again historically. Now this range is common, and now some people will be sensitive to newer values, to the uncommon. So the content of nobility changes, although its direction towards the uncommon remains the same, he writes. And he continues, in the historic process of the displacement of values, so this shifting of the torchlight from area to area and within the whole range of the scope of the firmament of values. In the historic process of the displacement of values, the essence of nobility is the perpetual anticipation, the searching and testing, the moving forward, which transforms the ethos of an epoch. Its content at any given moment must therefore be the moral claim of the uncommon, Without the noble, the process must needs stagnate, and since to stand still is an impossibility, become retrogressive. On the grand scale, nobility is the onward striving life of the historical ethos. In the individual is the spirit of the pioneer. So this whole way, again, I don't know where this lands in you. Someone says, oh, this sounds so elitist, and it's a certain view of history, and all that. But to me, there's something worth considering here. Again, we just want to open out some territory for our consideration. Doesn't mean we have to buy these ideas wholesale, but there is something, again, rarely considered in moral philosophy, perhaps here, that, again, as I said, has a importance for our considerations of soul making. So he says, as regards its content, the higher development of the human type always depends on the actual tendency, not perhaps the conscious aims, of the noble. It necessarily clashes with the interest of those who are accounted good, in inverted commas, and is always to some extent aloof from the community at large, and stands in open opposition to the universality of their standards. So again, we get this, some people would judge this this prioritizing of virtues to which they are blind. And there's a kind of, as he says, a clash between normally respected members of society, the normally good member of society, deemed good member of society. There's a kind of clash of interests and moral values and vision and sensibilities. And so there's a kind of separation there. An improvement in the standard is made possible by concentration of energy upon a narrower sphere. So again, there's this, which we touched on before, how is it that progress is often made, new territory is stretched into? It's by focusing on getting interested in something in particular and really heightening our focus, our work in that direction. Often. Hence the necessary remoteness of the selecting group from the general public. So, he also writes, it's quite strong, he writes, the noble man, again, excuse the gender biased language, it's hard to read, it's quite dense, it's hard to convert it as I'm reading. The noble man hates all compromise as to values, even those that are wise and beneficent. So this, can you get the sense of the kind of soul character of what he's talking about? A pioneer who is at odds with the sort of kind of entrenched, ordinary, common, respectable way of being. He's reaching out, he, she, they are reaching out, listening to some kind of sense of something else that is possible, some extension that's possible. And there is in that character a kind of dislike of compromise. They tend to be very uncompromising. The nobleman hates all compromise as to values, even those that are wise and beneficent. His salvation lies in another direction, in the exclusive fostering of the value which he thinks should be preferred, even at the expense of all others. So this kind of character can often seem to others a bit out of balance. They're sort of pressing on into the future in a way, into unexplored territory, and as such they can be leaning forward into that in a way that others would regard as being out of balance. And maybe it's part of the soul style. Is it always a demand for the soul to be balanced? So you get a lot of that in some interpretations of Jungian psychology. It's all about wholeness and balance. And yet there is a place for a lack of balance. Or perhaps there's a place for a lack of balance. Perhaps there's a soul style that goes with that. And yes, it comes with costs. So, again, this is an unusual consideration. It's an unusual way of thinking. It's perhaps controversial, but it might be relevant to certain souls, and it might be relevant to the duty that certain souls have, the particular duties that certain souls have, and the particular duties in the realm of values. And they always go together, duty and value. So the expanding into new territory of the valuational sensibility and the ethical sight. I'm not sure if some people, we've talked about values being intrinsic part of soul-making, as part of one of the elements of the imaginal, and everything we're talking about with ethics and how they can relate to values and how our relationship with values and virtues can be made soul-making in that way. One might, some people have sort of said something like this to me, consider that soul-making itself is a kind of value. So we value soul-making. And as such, that might be, some of these people were saying, a kind of what Hartmann would call a noble virtue, or one of the new, for our time, a relatively new value. We value something because it's soulful. We value soul-making. We value that whole ethos and that whole sensibility and sensitivity to existence, to self, other world, to the elements of our psychology, to the cosmos. And that in our time, that might be an expansion into newer territory in terms of a new virtue and new value, soul-making itself, perhaps, I don't know. The second thing, the second area that I'd like to consider, again, it's quite tricky territory, let's see how we do, is hatred. I want to see if it's possible to shine a little light, again, from the point of view of soul and what it might have to do with soul, hatred and soul. So, what do we mean by hatred? Actually, if you look it up in the dictionary, it just says something like intense dislike, which is good enough for our purposes right now. There's different schools that kind of go into the psychology of hatred in different ways, and in so doing they kind of define it in much more specific ways. So, but let's just say this intense dislike, and so to speak, to make almost like an enemy out of something. So it could be it could manifest in a kind of cold way. Some people put that in their definition of hatred, that has a kind of coldness. It's different than anger, which is hot. But I just include both. So it can be cold, it can be kind of withdrawn and out of relationship, or it can be hot and kind of ranting, whatever. Okay, so I'm also, with the definition, we should say hatred does not necessarily include ill will. Ill will means to wish harm on someone. Okay, so you can intensely dislike something, you can hate something without wishing a person or persons harm. It's not the same either as cruelty, which is kind of inflicting harm and enjoying, either inflicting harm or enjoying a harm that someone else is suffering. Those are, if you like, a whole step further from what I'm talking about here by hatred. Okay, so intense dislike that is, let's say, just doesn't include ill will or cruelty. That's something else. But let's see if we put this in a soul-making context, or bring together, shine a light from the perspective of soul-making teachings, if there's something that can be, if something worthwhile to consider here, it's helpful to open out. So I've said several times that kind of, if you like, maybe a really fundamental axiom of the soul-making dharma is soul loves soul-making. Soul wants soul-making. It sounds so simple. Soul wants soul-making. But in a way it might be possible to use that axiom in a very basic way, in the sense of take it as a first principle and see what follows from that principle. So rather than taking the human beings want attachment, or human beings want pleasure, or human beings want even biological survival, or whatever it is, those are the primary drives. What if we say, actually, soul wants soul-making, and that's, just entertain the idea that that's the primary drive. Our primary drive as human beings is to soul-making, and that gets diverted, subverted, etc. in different ways. What might ensue, what might that imply when we consider our psychology and our needs as human beings, and how we consider all kinds of things, for instance, developmental psychology, etc. So, the soul wants soul-making, which implies eros, because eros is an element of soul-making, indispensable element of soul-making. And soul-making also involves, with the eros, that the self, other, the world, and even our eros itself become imaginal. Yeah, so we've talked about all this. Self, other, world, and eros become imaginal. It's part of soul-making. Soul-making also asks or involves that the sense of self, other, world in our life, the senses of self, other, world in our life mirror those imaginal self, other worlds, etc. So there has to be, in some way, there has to be some refracting, some mirroring, some reflecting. And we also said that with the eros, there's always got to be this, there's always some beyond. There's always something to reach into, to grope into, to feel into, to sense into, to create, discover into. There's always the angel out ahead. So, we just pause there. So soul wants soul-making, but because of avidya, because of the basic delusional reification of self, other, world, and our elements of our psyche and psychology and being, for instance, eros, because of delusional reification, avidya, because of cultural indoctrination, because of limited patterns or limitations on the movement and the growth, the expansion of eros, of psyche, of logos, and also of emotional heart life and energy in general. The soul often moves in a direction that is not soul-making. Okay, so we've been through all this on other retreats and talks. The soul wants soul-making, but because of all these other conditions, avidya, indoctrination from culture, limited patterns of eros, psyche, logos, and emotion, it often moves in a direction that's not soul-making. So, of course, many people would contest that idea that the basic sort of drive is to soul-making, but and say something like, before all this soul-making stuff and eros for soul-making, which is kind of like an icing on the cake, souls, beings, egos want to live. They want to have biological survival. They want to feel well. They want pleasurable sensations, for its pleasure principle and all that. But, we're not clinging to this as a sort of dogmatic ultimate truth, this idea that soul, what souls want most fundamentally is soul-making. We're just entertaining it as a certain idea, and it can be very illuminating, I think, and open up different perspectives and avenues in our life. But B, it's like you can just look throughout history, and even today in the West, there's countless numbers of human beings choose soul-making over and before pleasure, over and before even health, and sometimes even physical survival. So with regards to dying or living, sometimes making choices in the service of something that's soul-making, despite the material, hedonic, meaning the pleasure, the cost to material cost, hedonic cost, in terms of it's painful, it's unpleasant, and despite physical cost. So there's countless examples that bear witness to that prioritizing of soul-making over any of these other drives, if you like, that are usually considered more primary. Something can trump all those. A person can say, doesn't matter if I die. I sacrifice my health, I sacrifice my material well-being, my pleasure, etc. Let's play with this principle. Soul wants soul-making as a fundamental drive, perhaps the fundamental drive, with everything that's involved in soul-making. Now, sometimes what happens, of course, is the soul-making is blocked. It's not possible, or in some ways it's blocked, with some inner or outer blocks. It's not possible for the sense of self, other, world, and eros to become imaginal. Either one has only literalized the desire, so there's desire there, it's craving rather than eros, and nothing is imaginal for whatever reason, or in the blocking, one literalizes desire. So that can go both ways. That only literalized desire blocks the soul-making, or when soul-making is blocked in some other way, then the desire is still there sometimes, and it can only get literalized because it can't get transformed by and dimensionalized by the soul-making process. And then a few different things can happen. One is we can try and have whatever it is, the object that we want. So hatred often arises when there's something we want, when I can't have it. So we can try and have that. And as we've talked about before, without the eros being allowed to instigate the soul-making dynamic and things to become imaginal, have dimensions and have depth, etc., then this desire is just craving and not eros, and it has to move, so to speak, on a one-dimensional plane. It has to move flatly in the flat world into a kind of greed for more and more things, or into a kind of consumerism. That's one option. Another option, when the soul-making is blocked and there's still this desire, is that there's a kind of collapse, a despair, and the being collapses, and you can sort of see it in a person's body language and demeanor at a certain time, or as a more general trend in their whole life, because there's been a kind of more habitual collapse of this whole of the whole soul, in a way, or a large portion of the soul, because the eros is not, the libido and the eros are not allowed to grow and to extend things. And sometimes with that despair and collapse, there's a kind of withdrawal, what some psychologists call a kind of schizoid withdrawal. One sort of retreats back out of relationship with the other, or an other or others. What happens then to the eros, or the desire? And a third possibility is hatred ensues. Okay, so when we're frustrated in our desires, in the desires of our soul, we either reify something and go to a kind of greed or craving on a flat level, collapse in despair inwardly, in this kind of withdrawal out of relationship, or move into or something gets transformed into a kind of hatred, or some combination of those three. The hatred is interesting as well, because it often comes out of a feeling of, or a perception of powerlessness, of my powerlessness. The powerlessness of self in its desire with regard to something for the self, or its desire for something with regard to an other, or its desire in the world, and not being able to have that. And sometimes when that's intense, there's a feeling of powerlessness. So I really want to focus on certain kinds of hatred. So it's a very particular, certain manifestations of hatred that I want to talk about. But you can see this link with powerlessness, if you weren't already aware of it. Powerlessness and hatred often go together. So if you find yourself in a really difficult contraction of hatred, one of the first things to do when you're working with it is to ask in what ways do I feel powerlessness, or what is the particular kind of powerlessness I feel. So you can see, for example, sometimes someone who's, let's say, a kind of secularist in some ways, or I just use that word in the sense of an opposition to a kind of religious fundamentalist, so I use the word secularist in a particular way. They may hate religious fundamentalists when they feel powerless in relation to them, either because they feel powerless in relation to sort of a group of terrorists, let's say, or they're living in a community or a country or a regime that has an oppressive religious law, and they might hate that because there's a powerlessness in that. Conversely, I think probably a lot of religious fundamentalists hate secularists sometimes when they feel powerless in relationship to them. For example, they may feel, I think a lot of religious fundamentalists in the world probably do feel powerless with respect to the sweeping power, if you like, of capitalist and modernist views, and kind of modernist, what they would regard as immorality and amorality. So there's hatred and powerlessness go together. Usually the hatred often comes out of or from a feeling of powerlessness. That's quite an important thing to be aware of and to explore, as I said. But I really want to talk about quite specific or kinds of hatred, a bit more narrow ones that don't just involve powerlessness, but powerlessness in relation to what may be soul-making. Where the soul wants soul-making and somehow it's blocked, and maybe doesn't even realize that what it wants is soul-making. So that's partly why I'm saying all this. Let's see. So, now actually on the theme of power, before we move on, the theme of power, there's actually a lot of energy, a lot of libido, a lot of life force tied up in hatred. It can feel completely frozen and completely contracted and imprisoned and not very powerful, but actually tied up in it, because there's so much energy tied up in it, it can actually, there's potentially a lot of power in it. So it can, there's a possibility of liberating that power and energy. And again, it depends what we do with that power. So it comes from a feeling of powerlessness, but it actually has in it the potential of a lot of power. And that power can go in the soul-making direction, can kickstart, galvanize, instigate, open up, and give give energy to the direction of soulmaking, to things becoming images, to the imaginal sense of self, other, world, and eros. Or it can get stuck in that withdrawal and despair, and that tightness there, that contraction actually has a lot of power. It takes quite a lot to keep the soul bound up like that, to keep the being contracted like that and withdrawn like that. Or this potential power can move in the direction of literalized action, maybe action to destroy the object of hatred, or to work towards what is actually desired. There's potentially a lot of power in hatred. It feels once we get under the sort of obvious feelings of hatred, then there's a sense of powerlessness, and underneath that is the potential of liberating power. And the question is, and what will we do with that power? Where will it go? So, anyway, hatred comes out of, usually, a feeling or a perception of powerlessness of the self in relation to its desire for something in regard to self, other, world. Now, an interesting thing about hatred, and this is the particular kind of hatred I want to talk about, is that, I don't know if you've noticed, oftentimes certain kinds of hatred arise for what is quite close or similar. So it's very common, for example, to people within a certain religious tradition to end up hating, intensely disliking, or opposing, and making a kind of enemy or polemic out of someone in the same tradition whose teachings are in some ways very similar, or in the realm of philosophy, or in the realm of psychological schools of psychology, or whatever. So that's also quite interesting. Why is it that certain kinds of hatred arise much more for or towards something, some expression or manifestation that's actually not too far from one's own position? So if we think, for example, it's unlikely that someone in the insight meditation tradition, and that has a range to it, would start hating, I don't know, the proponents of indigenous belief from Papua New Guinea or something like that. It's too dissimilar. But within that range of what is quite similar, let's say the insight meditation tradition, or you say Tibetan Buddha Dharma or whatever, there can be intense polemic. The insight meditation tradition tends not to speak these things, but they simmer along there in the background, and you can hear them come out, and you've probably heard it seep out of this voice at times. And certainly the Tibetans are much more open about it and engage in, I think, probably much healthier, open polemic that's quite cutting and intense at times. So why the similarity? Is it something to do with the relationship between eros and hatred? And are there certain souls who might have, if you like, a lot of soulfulness, a lot of disposition towards soulfulness, towards soul-making, towards image, towards eros, that may be in some ways liable to or prone to this kind of hatred for something that's actually quite similar. So eros, so what's the connection here possibly? Eros delineates, right? We talked about this when we went into a lot of detail in previous retreats. So what does eros do? It complexifies, it creates distinctions, it creates and discovers more and more faces in what it loves, and carves its kind of relationship with those particulars, of which making those distinctions, discovering, creating those distinctions, those different faces and those delineations is part of the whole process. And certainly one can get attached to those. But there's something probably more primary even than the attachment, is the fear of the dissolving of the objects of eros that have been created, discovered through this process of fine delineation, of subtle discernment, discrimination, subtle kind of differentiation into different aspects. Do you understand? So it's unlikely to when another, let's say, teaching or tradition or school of thought or whatever it is quite close. It's maybe it presents more of a danger to one's own objects of eros, what one has delineated and what one loves in terms of what's opening up for oneself. So where there's less similarity, where the difference is huge, it's strangely less likely that hatred arises. Somehow the object of my eros, that which I love, that which I'm discovering and creating here in terms of thought and the direction of my eros and the whole sense of soul there, carving that out in terms of self, other, world, if that's blocked somewhere or crowded out by something that's similar, but in the similarity tends to be heard or seen in a way that kind of washes over all differences, then the hatred might arise, is more likely to arise. This is interesting. So, is there a relationship between eros and hatred? You know, hatred in Pali, in Sanskrit, the word is dvesha, and the root there is from dwa, which means two, to make two, and of course, with the two-ness is part of the eros as well. This is why this sort of eros can be dangerous, double-edged sword, if you like. And is there some connection here in the need to differentiate and the actual differentiation that comes with eros and the tendency or the danger of hatred there? So, I'm thinking also of James Hillman at this point, who said somewhere or other, you have to hate something. And he, if you read some of his, more in interviews and things, but it comes across in writings as well as quite polemic. And I think what he would have openly called a hatred of different schools of psychology. Now notice that his hatred was for psychologists. He was a psychologist hating different or varying schools of psychology. And so, you know, and trying, so for instance, there was a teacher of his at the Jung Institute called Marie-Louise from France, and she presented a certain picture of psychology, and particularly of poor psychology and other things, which affronted Hillman's own soul sensibility and the kind of careful differentiations that his soul-making process made, that his eros and the eros of his intellect and sensibility made. And so he kind of, in a way, hated her teachings. And he also hated the kind of, what he regarded as the dominant sort of psychology at the time, where he was beginning to write, the dominant sort of ego psychology or behavioral psychology. And so, in a way, the preponderance of those and the power of Marie-Louise from France being an authority in the Jungian school, and the power wielded by the dominant psychological paradigms, perhaps made him feel a relative lack of power. And the danger, as I said, of what he wanted to find out for himself, discover, create space for, present both to his soul and to the soul of the world and to others, those faces were in danger of getting covered over. And in that there was a feeling of a relative lack of power, perhaps. But what was interesting in that case, and it's part of what I want to say, is he was able to kind of mobilize a power for himself in actuality by writing and speaking, and also by working with and supporting others whose work he sympathized with. And in doing all that, in beginning to write and speak and carve out this vision, this soul vision and soul sensibility, and present it as something different and differentiable, and present it to the world, and in a way he became also image for himself. And his eros, all of it was allowed to be come into the soul-making process. And even the other then can be a kind of imaginal other, in terms of the other as the object of hatred, whether it's a school or a person kind of embodying the school or whatever. It's not actually, as I said, it's not ill will, it's not harm, but it can become can become imaginal and not reified. So with that potential sort of obliteration and covering over and loss of what his soul-making process, the differentiations, the aspects of divinity, the aspects of soul that his soul-making process was revealing and creating and revealing to himself. And the danger of, faced with the danger of that, faced with the kind of relative powerlessness or perception of relative powers in that wider situation, yet he was able to act and move in a way that the whole landscape of that whole environment and the whole constituents of that landscape in the world of psychology became actually imaginal for him. And he himself, an imaginal character in that landscape, an imaginal warrior. And remember, the erotic imaginal always has these beyonds to it. So you get the similar thing with the warrior always fighting as an image. There's not an end to this. It's not necessarily an end to some of these battles. Just some revolutionaries, so to speak, actually need a constant revolution. It's not actually, the soul would not be satisfied with arriving at some kind of finished utopia. There's this beyond there. So, faced with this kind of thing, then there's the desire, there's the frustrated desire, there's the incipient movement of the eros, and the sensed powerlessness and danger with respect to what it wants. It could be anything that the soul wants. But getting what one wants, or what one thinks one wants, in some of those situations may not actually be soul-making. That's a point to bear in mind. So one way out of all this is to, one way out to dissolve the hatred is to really let go, of, in terms of what's going on in some of the classical teachings of Buddha Dharma. Another is when the self actually does manage to get some power and no longer feels so powerless. So to some degree there's a decrease of the sense of powerlessness, and to some degree the sense of the self that's desired, the sense of whatever the other is that's desired, and the sense of the world that one's in that's desired, those are achieved kind of materially or literally. And that would be a way also out of the hatred. But another is for something to become image, the self, other world, eros to become image, or some combination of all these avenues out of it. But it's worth bearing in mind that sometimes, as I said, getting what one wants, in other words, the literal achievement of what one desires, may or may not be soul-making. If if the self, other world, and eros don't open up to the imaginal, with this open-endedness there, and the beyondness, the forever beyondness there, then that process may not be soul-making. And we talked about in that connection, we've talked about before on previous retreats, the need for boundaries, because boundaries make two. There's a boundary between this and that, between number one and number two. So boundaries, limits, actually form part of the crucible of soul-making. So sometimes, as I said, getting what one wants, if one's not careful, that's not actually soul-making. If I get what I want, there has to be something more that I haven't got that I want. There's the extension into the beyonds of the eros, the angel out ahead, always moving ahead, the infinite growth of those beyonds. So there's still a boundary between what I have and what I don't have that can potentially allow soul-making process. So I can end the hatred by getting what I want, but it might not be soul-making. And what's the fundamental desire there? Is it to get what I want, or is it actually the soul-making? And then I've sold it short by just getting what I want, but I've flattened it. So hatred will stay as kind of poisonous hatred, and it really can be very poisonous and very imprisoning, and toxic in the way it seeps out to other people as well. When self, other world, and eros cannot become image, it can be transformed. It can dissolve when we let go, when we really fully let go in the sense in the usual dharmic sense, or when we get some power in terms of what we want, or when things become image and they really are allowed to become imaginal. I was struck. I don't know if you saw it. There was a video someone sent me. I don't know when it was. Sometime in the last 3 years, and it was, I think, as someone had posted on Facebook or something, was a kind of selfie video that this young woman had taken. I think she was Swedish, but I can't remember. And she had boarded a plane which was deporting like a regular airline flight to Afghanistan or somewhere, and it contained an Afghani man that was being deported, probably facing great threat to his life back in Afghanistan. And she boarded this plane and took a selfie of herself standing up, so that and refusing to sit down when they asked everyone to sit down so they could take off. And she filmed it on her camera. She disrupted the flight, and she and the Afghani man were removed. But I was so touched by seeing this video. I don't know if you saw it. It was sort of, I think it was quite popular. She was then in a situation where there were potentially a great deal of powerlessness, a sense of powerlessness. She actually did something quite brave and extraordinary. I thought very beautiful in the kind of the grace with which she did it and the largeness of soul with which she did it. But it was self-empowering, in the sense that instead of just feeling powerless in terms of that terrible situation, she did something which was self-empowering. And what was so by empowering herself that way, there was, I don't know if she would have gotten contracted into hate, but there was certainly much less chance. There was the dissolving of any chance of hatred through the self-empowering. And hatred often goes with this kind of hardness of heart, There's something really brittle and contracted there. And part of what was really touching to me seeing this was just how vulnerable she could be at the same time. She was very strong, standing up, being very firm with those who were shouting at her and criticizing her and calling her names. She was very strong, very upright, very bold, very courageous, very clear, and at the same time very vulnerable. So she was crying, and there was a richness of soul there. There was a breadth of soul. There wasn't any hardness there at all. And it was interesting too, again, we're talking about ethics, so in terms of some of what people who didn't like what she was doing, some of the other passengers on the flight complained about the inconvenience. And what about, there are children on the plane, etc. You're upsetting the children. And again, you can hear there the sort of opposition of different value systems. I would say actually values of different heights in this hierarchy of values. Inconvenience, how high a value, how important a value is convenience. And there's so often this trope of upsetting the children, as if that's something that's kind of become something almost sacred above in some people's outlook in our culture. So that those values like that become somehow more important or eclipse the value of care, of kindness, of compassion, of saving someone's life, of standing up to injustice. And again, so we have to be very careful with hatred. I'm just talking there about certain manifestations of hatred that come out of actually at their root there's a blocked soul-making. There's some soul-making and some direction of eros and image and soulfulness that wants to be allowed to flourish, wants to be given space to carve out a pathway for soul, and it's blocked, and hatred can come out of that. And sometimes we're just so in the hatred we don't actually quite realize the different levels of what's going on, even the level of the powerlessness, etc. And in some of those instances it's worth it's not easy, but it's worth perhaps approaching it with this lens, to do with power and powerlessness and soul-making and what the soul might want there that's getting blocked, and are there ways for it to open up the situation imaginally, etc. So again, I'm tricky territory, difficult, potentially contentious, but really important to consider when we if we want to bring in the reflections of about soul and considerations of soul into our considerations and reflections on ethics and morality and also psychology more generally. Okay, a third, example of a kind of unusual, an area that's unusual, an area of virtue or values that's unusual to consider, but that also might have something to do with what's a personal calling for some souls, is one I've mentioned before in one of the earlier talks, in the talks on ethics. It's this love of the remote. So I want to say something about that. I think it was coined by Nietzsche as an idea, but I'm not entirely sure. So what is this love of the remote? Well, I've actually mentioned it earlier, but I want to go into it again in a little more detail. So there is for us a kind of bond with those that are nearest in us, to us in the community. We have an obligation to them, etc. We feel that bond. We rub shoulders with them. We feel moral duty and concern in relation to them. Love of the remote has one of its aspects is it's for a love for and an obligation for a moral duty, or it's a sense of love, a sense of obligation, a sense of moral duty to the future, if you like, to the following generation or following generations. That's one aspect of it. I'll qualify it a bit more in a second, in a minute. So Hartmann writes about this, and he says the responsibility which arises therefrom, the responsibility which arises from this, the responsibility of this responsibility to the future, this particular kind of responsibility to the future, signifies a solidarity of a newer and greater kind than that of justice, brotherly love, and faith. Like these, it is a bond, a fellowship, a pledge, a joint responsibility of person for person. But it's different, he says. In it, the man of today, against, pardon the language, gender-biased language, in it the man of today feels himself one with the man of the faraway future, though the latter, the man of the faraway future, will have forgotten him and cannot be of help to him. The temporal direction of cause and effect is not reversible. The influence of man on man, solidarity itself, is only one-sided. Only he who lived previously can be of service to him who lives afterwards. The successor bears no retrospective obligation. Instead, there falls to him a new obligation towards the generations coming after him. Solidarity is directed forward only. Its form is progress, not coexistence. Still it is a bond which is great not only in extent, but great in the quality of its task. So there's perhaps some overlap here with what he calls nobility. And again, we're talking about something that not everyone will resonate with, not everyone will feel a soul calling and a duty in this direction. But he continues, that it is a bond of a more fragile kind, that it is taken so much less earnestly by the living than is the solidarity of justice or love. This is not due to its own nature. It is due to the moral immaturity of the living, to their not having wakened to their greatest task. It is their lack of thorough self-conquest which transcends the sphere of the now and the near. So again, it's quite strong language. But he's saying sometimes we get so preoccupied or so limited in our sense of the scope of our obligations that we forget that we might have a greater obligation to the sort of progress of humanity, if you like. Yes. So yes, in German it's called Fensterliebe, and it was in fact Nietzsche who coined the term. It's very characteristic of Nietzsche, and sort of something that he was perhaps the first person to promote, I think, the first person to sort of cotton onto and sense really keenly. And he had an imbalanced relationship with it because he neglected, said its antinomical value in the love of the nearest. So Hartmann criticizes him for that, which I think is a good point. But then, I'm going to read another passage. It says, love of the remotest, at first, really requires an overcoming of one's commitment to the nearest. So this is interesting. Again, we're talking about values that have antinomical relationships. It is the same overcoming which generally inheres in the nature of a future intention. Everything which is dear and entrusted to man attaches to the immediate environment, usually. Here, an attachment of love to the remote is demanded. Somehow I have to feel this attachment, this moral obligation to the remote, the far future. Hence, not only natural inclination, but also genuine moral habit must be overcome, he says. A valuable commitment not acquired without moral struggle, is to retire into the background and give way to another ethos. So we maybe worked hard to practice love of the nearest, to practice altruism, and in a way, at a certain stage, maybe something else has to come in, and that love of the nearest has to kind of, relatively speaking, diminish in our hierarchy of priorities for some. So it's the conquering of a product of previous self-conquest. Love of the nearest, or altruism, went counter to self-love, to egoism. It was a tremendous extension of the sphere of life, efficiency, evaluation, participation. Now even this widened sphere is seen to be too narrow, to be a drag on the intention of love. Love of the nearest does not go beyond one's contemporary. Its effect does not endure. It dies with its object. It is not adapted to the continuation of its object, but to his present existence. Love of the remotest seeks a different measure of efficiency, an efficacy which will last. So I said I'd qualify what he means here, and he doesn't mean that some of you will have heard, the need to consider the next 7 generations in our choices now. So that to me is absolutely critical when we're talking about things like species loss and climate change, and we really need to bring that kind of thinking, this care for the future, this care for the next 7 generations, 70 generations, but in terms of the totality, everyone in those generations we need to care for. That's, to me, a given and just common ethical, well, it should be common ethical sense. But he's actually talking about something different here. It's not obvious from the language, love of the remote, but he writes, in love of the nearest, the energy of striving, as it has no choice, reconciles itself with whoever is accidentally at hand. It's just the practicing of kindness and concern and empathy and support to whoever's around one. It has nothing to do with whether that person is worthy or not, just as when we teach metta. It's unconditional in that. So it's not interested in assessing whether someone is worthy or unworthy of that kindness, that love of the nearest. With love of the remotest, though, is different. Okay, and this is again where it might be somewhat contentious to some people to hear. It might sound somewhat contentious. With love of the remotest, the opposite is true. The energy of striving, he writes, shall serve not the nearest but the best, whom it will bring to further fruition. Herein, a selection of persons from the point of view of values is introduced, a selection which on its side does not refer to the given person at all, but to the type of man. So there's this, in this kind of love that Nietzsche was sort of promulgating, and that Hartmann's picking up on, and I think Max Scheler as well, there's this interest in those in the far future, but those, if you like, the most morally ready, the most morally capable, what he calls the best in the future. So it's really quite elitist and quite selective. And it does consider worth, and it does consider along lines, evaluate in terms of values and virtues, and moral capacity and sensibility. So again, this is probably not at all fashionable in a lot of circles nowadays, and a lot of our current way of thinking in our society. It's worth noting, and there's in the Pali Canon several times where it mentions that the Buddha, when he was going to give a Dharma talk, with his psychic powers, with his siddhis, would survey the audience and find who was nearest to awakening. Not those who were already arahants, neither those who were near the beginning. He would sort of get a sense of where everyone was at with his psychic powers, and he would aim his talk, he would pitch his talk at those who were nearest to awakening. Not at the beginners, not at those far away, but those who are nearest to awakening. Is there again a kind of, he's aiming at the the best, that is aiming at a certain capacity. And how rare that is for us to think that way these days. For many of us, it contravenes a sort of another kind of law, ethical law, which is this love of the nearest, which often goes with a concern for who's weakest, who's more the beginner, who's more in need, etc. So there is this antinomy between these two valuational pools and duties. And Hartmann criticized Nietzsche for being too one-sided and neglecting the love of the nearest. But there's this antinomy, there's this tension there. Let's see. So this kind of, because it puts one out of relationship a little bit, or less in relationship with those that are around one, and the demands and the sort of more immediate and obvious contacts that we have with those around one. This is a hard value. It's a hard virtue, and Hartmann writes, the way of the creative spirit is hard. So there's something in this of the creative, because again we're forging into new territory, giving a gift to those in the remote future who may be able to understand something that's not necessarily easily understandable now, who may be able to sense and who may have a capacity that's not readily available now, for the sake of some larger process of humanity, perhaps, also for the sake, because some people's souls are called to do that. But this way of the creative spirit is hard. There's a creative spirit in this. And he says, it is as hard towards oneself as towards another. It's tough. It doesn't set much store by either. Both are means, either oneself or another, regarding oneself as a means. So in this kind of hard work there's a kind of, it's a tough love. One's hard on oneself. One's not soft and mollycoddly and giving in to what one needs, even though one might be, if you like, isolated in that venture, in that endeavour, in that work. To be a means, he writes, is what is hard for any man. All that is sensitive in him protests. Here the a priorism of sympathy must be silenced. So even sympathy for oneself. Another a priorism, which is also fraught with value, rises up against it, a prophetic sense of the ethical potentiality in man, his latent capacity, the future value which transcends his own person and his own environment. So I don't know if you can get a sense of the kind of loneliness of that, isolation, struggle, potential to be misunderstood, etc. There's maybe an overlap here in the realm of aesthetics, and like I said, for me, sometimes I'm not even sure I make a distinction between aesthetic sensibility and moral sensibility. I class them all together sometimes, but I'm reminded of, if there's a similarity or overlap, I don't know, but I'm reminded of Beethoven in his late period, in his last years. He'd gone deaf quite a bit before that, but he was able to write quite brilliant music with no real loss to the quality, extraordinary quality of his music, even though he was deaf. But in his late period, he sort of opened out a whole new way of composing, a whole new way of thinking about music. And his contemporaries thought he'd gone mad, actually. They couldn't make head or tail of this new music, the late string quartets or some of the late piano pieces. And it wasn't that they thought, oh, he's gone deaf, because they knew he could write when he's deaf. They thought he'd gone mad. They thought he'd just lost it. But he knew what he was doing, and he said, and something I think Mahler said as well, of his symphonies, when people, no one really listens to your music, he said, both Beethoven and Mahler said, these are for other generations, they're for future generations. So there's a solitude in that. There's a hard task in that, a hard duty. When your attachment, when your love, when your care is for those in the future, and the fruits of which, the thanks for which you will never know. You won't even know if it will land. You won't know if it will be received. And in the isolation of that, there can be difficulty. So as I said, actually, this is something also Hartmann picks up on. It's a strange venture, this one, because we really don't know the future. When there's the love of the nearest, I'm dealing with these people around me. I can see what they need. I can feel it. I know I'm addressing something real. There's a chance that it will. It's obvious to me that we're talking about real needs, and they're reasonable. It's a reasonable outpouring of my love and my care and my concern. But when there's love of the remotest, I don't know. I don't know what its actual effect will be. Maybe there won't be anything, and all this sacrifice is in vain. And not only is it in vain, but in so doing and sacrificing, I'm actually sinning, to use Hartmann's word, against my contemporaries and those around me. So in this respect, he says, love of the remotest is worse than any other virtue, but especially so in its damage to brotherly love, which is always sure of its immediate objects, and which, even when it does not achieve them, is sure that they are reasonable. We just said that. There's something about this, and I just read it again, another paragraph from Hartmann. Again, this really may not resonate with some of you. I'm sure it won't, but some of you will hear the kind of soulfulness in this, and the kind of beauty of this. And it may be for some of you that this kind of love is part of your personal soul calling. The way your personality, your ideal personality, your soul weighs up preferentially between different values. So it says, love of the remotest excels brotherly love and every other virtue on certain accounts. Greatness of moral spirit, intensity of spiritual energy, which is required in the taking upon oneself of what is inherently uncertain. The venture is great. Only a deep and mighty faith, permeating a person's whole being, is equal to it. It is a faith of a unique kind, different from trust between man and man. A faith which reaches out to the whole of things and can do no other than stake all it has. It is faith on the grand scale, faith in a higher order, which determines the cosmic meaning of man. When it becomes active and carries out its schemes, its work is of historic import. And this energy is harmonious with a similar feeling, what he calls hope, when it is raised to its highest power, the basic feeling of ethical idealism, which bears all things and gladly suffers for an idea, with a capital I, so that transcendent moral value. It bears all things and gladly suffers for that soul sense of the values in their transcendent dimensionality, divinity, beyondness, its love for them, never despairing. Hope, the peculiar assurance which takes hold of one who risks all on a single issue. So again, sometimes we might find ourselves engaged in something. We talk about our duty, our moral duty to our fellow, to our fellow human beings. And sometimes we're limited in our sense of scope of who our moral duty is. Again, it's interesting reading moral philosophers how often they neglect the natural world and our moral duty to the natural world and moral duty to animals. It's all very anthropocentric. And then there's also this potential limiting just to my the love of the nearest, just those who are around me now, and not so much the vision opening to this love of the remotest. In a way, we could also add, and maybe it's actually akin to, maybe it's a different name for the same thing, our duty to the angels. Sometimes angels want something. In fact, they always want something from us. And sometimes what they want is quite hard. It's a big ask. And sometimes we're engaged in a work that it may seem it doesn't have any bearing on or effect or on our contemporaries, on those around us. No one else seems to value it. It seems like it won't have any impact. But there may be a duty to the angels, and maybe the angels are the face of the remote, the face of those souls in the far future who will have a capacity. So, as I said, 3 or 4 kind of potentially controversial ideas there. But also potentially very relevant to our considerations of both soul-making and ethics, and certainly of the way in which the needs of individual souls within the realm of ethics, and the needs of individual souls to find their particular callings, particular duties, to manifest and realize their ideal personality, in Hartmann's words, how all that mixes with and is part of the bigger vision of ethics. So in regard to personhood, personality, soul, etc., Alistair McIntyre, again, and I think it's in his book After Virtue, yes, also talks a little bit about this, but not so much, but from quite a different perspective, not using our language or Hartmann's language really. He talks about the potential for a kind of narrative unity for a life, for a human life. That there's some sense of weaving together, creating, discovering, these are my words now, creating, discovering a kind of soul story, narrative unity, in which our identity, our particular soul, the face of our soul is bound. So that has something to do with what we would, what Hartmann would call his personality, etc. And but he uses different language, and he writes, "In what does the unity of an individual life consist?" One of the reasons he's, before I go on, one of the reasons he's asking this is because one of his sort of tentative conclusions in his book was that it's only when there's a kind of unity of a life that all the virtues kind of make sense and they find their place within that unity. So I don't know whether we need to necessarily believe that, or whether we can also have this kind of view of, as Hillman says, a polytheistic psyche, but even a polytheistic psyche can have a certain unity at another level to it. But for Alistair McIntyre, this idea of a unity is something which makes sense of virtues. Without a sense of a unity to the kind of movement of one's life and the direction of one's life, all these competing, potentially competing values can't be assessed, judged, placed in relative order of duty and importance, etc., for the individual. Anyway, in what does the unity of an individual life consist? The answer is that its unity is the unity of a narrative embodied in a single life. So to ask, what is the good for me, in other words, what is the morally good for me, is to ask how best I might live out that unity and bring it to completion. The unity of a human life is the unity of a narrative quest. And he says, a quest for what? And then he says a couple of things which I think are very interesting before coming to his tentative conclusion. He says, two key features of a medieval conception of a quest need to be recalled. The first is that without some at least partly determinate conception of the final telos, the final goal, there could not be any beginning to a quest. Some conception of the good of man is required. So some conception of what is good is required to start the quest for what is good. Secondly, it is clear the medieval conception of a quest is not at all that of a search for something already adequately characterized, as miners search for gold or geologists for oil. It is in the course of the quest, and only through encountering and coping with the various particular harms, dangers, temptations and distractions which provide any quest with its episodes and incidents, that the goal of the quest is finally to be understood. A quest is always an education, both as to the character of that which is sought and in self-knowledge. So he writes, and then a provisional conclusion about the good life for man is that it is the life spent in seeking for the good life of man. It's the life on this quest which intuits partially what it's looking for. This has some sense of what's good and valuable, what's some sense of its final telos. And is also in its process an education, both as regards to the goal, but also as regards to the self. The good life for man, his tentative conclusion, provisional conclusion, he says, it's the life spent in seeking for the good life for man. And the virtues necessary for the seeking are those which enable us to understand what more and what else the good life for man is. So that's, again, with regard to the place of personality, personhood, self, uniqueness in our moral explorations and our explorations of morality. This is another way of thinking about it. So this quest involves search, involves eros, regarding values, involves stretch, involves questioning, and is potentially, and I read what he's just, what I've just read of what he's written, I read that as potentially open-ended, as the whole soul-making process is, and perhaps the start of the whole series, saying perhaps our exploration of morality is inevitably, or it should be inevitably, inherently open-ended. We will never finish with this area. So one idea of what unifies a human life and gives it that stamp, mark, face of our unique soul is our unique quest for goodness, for moral goodness, for understanding values, and towards those values, moral and include aesthetic and all that, which speak to us, which touch us, which are necessary. And as I said, maybe that will vary from person to person to a certain extent, as we've touched on, and it might be open-ended, and I think it should be open-ended. Okay, so these are some, as I said, perspectives and ideas to ponder, to think about, to reflect on. Some of them, as I said, not easy, not simple, and some of them relatively rare in what usually gets considered. And let's stop there for today.
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed, please visit dharmaseed.org. www.soulmaking.org/donate.